Hey friends, hope everybody's doing well. So here's the picture I'm going to be working from today. This is a scene from my hometown of Phoenix, Arizona. It's a bike path that runs along one of the many canals that crisscross the city, and in the background you've got the Phoenix Mountain Preserve and Piestewa Peak. Huge desert preserve in the middle of the city. And then you've got that beautiful sky with those puffy clouds. It's just such a quintessentially Phoenix scene, and I figured it would be a good way to pay homage to my hometown. So, as always, I've done a value study to try to understand the scene better. It's a fairly simple composition, and I think it's a strong composition because you've got this vanishing point about right here where all of these lines end up. And then you've got a different one for the top of the power poles somewhere back here. So, in this value study, I've broken the scene down into 3 values: light, middle, and dark. The light values are represented by the white of the paper, and then the middle values, I've just used a middle wash of Payne's gray. And what I do is I try to find a way to connect all of the different areas where I've decided, okay, this is going to be middle value. I want it all to be one big shape. And you'll notice that all of these areas run together. They all touch each other. And then once I have the big middle value shape, I can go and add darks, which would be the third value. And I'm only adding darks in a few areas just to make certain things pop. And we've also got the water with these poles reflecting in the canal. So this is going to be a very interesting and dynamic scene to paint. I imagine it's going to be challenging, but I'm feeling up to it. So let's go ahead and wet down both sides of the paper with the sponge. So the reason for wetting both sides of the paper down is so that it lays flat on my board without me having to tape it down. And then also, it stays wet longer, which gives me more time to work wet into wet. I'm also going back over with a wrung out sponge, and I'm soaking up some of the excess water on the back side. Just makes things a little easier to control. I don't need it to be soaking wet. All right. So we're going to start with this sky. It's a very light colored sky. Mix up some cerulean blue. I've got my nice big palette here, so I have tons of room to mix. And then the sky gets quite a bit lighter as it moves down towards the horizon, so as it moves down, I'll add more of this cobalt turquoise light into the mix. So it'll be cerulean blue and cobalt turquoise light, and then towards the top, it will be more cerulean blue. And I need to be careful to paint around the shape of these clouds that I want in here. Nice fluffy clouds. And since the paper is damp, these clouds will naturally have a nice soft edge to them. And then I'm going to go back and add some color to the cloud themselves. So that they aren't just pure white. I'll add some shadows on the bottom side and give them some shape, some volume. I'm not exactly copying the photo, just using it as a reference. That's why it's called a reference photo. You don't want to copy it exactly. Just use it as inspiration and make the painting whatever you want it to be. And then right about here, I'm going to start throwing more of that turquoise light into the mix. Paint right through that tree, since that will be much darker later on. Wash off the brush. So, I need to mix up a really light gray for the shadow side of those clouds. So, a good way to make gray is burnt umber, ultramarine blue. You can also use cobalt blue. It just gives a slightly different kind of gray. Depends on what you want. I'm going to tap that brush on that rag to get rid of some of the excess water. I want this to be a pretty subtle effect for these clouds. Just giving them a little volume. Making them more 3D. And the reason for tapping the brush on that rag is to, like I said, get rid of the excess water, because when you're painting wet into wet, if the paint you're dropping onto the paper is wetter than the paper, you'll get cauliflower edges, which is not what I want. I like these soft blooming edges. This is a great time of year to be in Phoenix. It's winter right now. The weather is fantastic. Not too cold, very mild. In the summer, though, it's a different story. Most of the summer you'll spend between 105 and 115 degrees, and that's from May to October. But the winter and the fall is amazing. I'm going to take a clean, damp brush and just smooth the edges of some of these clouds. I don't really think I'm going to do too much more to the sky. I think we might be pretty much done. I wanted the sky to be very subtle in this piece. Very subtle. Now we can continue working down. Now this is just the first wash, which is all about laying down the lightest colors of the painting, including pure white. So this mountain looks like probably a warmer gray. Maybe cooler than that, actually. Cool it down so it can be pushed farther back into the distance. Out here in the Phoenix Mountain Preserve is actually where I go trail running. It's a beautiful park. You would have no idea you were in the middle of a city when you're out there. That's a little too intense, so just scrub that out. Mix it around. And just continuing down. Dropping some warm color for the bank of this canal. And some more warm color for this gravel area here. Warming it up more as it comes closer to the viewer. It's kind of a rule of thumb. Warm things tend to be closer, and then cool things tend to be far away. Obviously, that's not a set in stone rule, but generally speaking, it's kind of how it goes. It's just a way to help give the illusion of distance and closeness. Dropping in some of that sky color for the water, the areas of the water that are going to be actually reflecting the sky. Quite a bit of this water is going to be darkened up. And more warm for that gravel. Warm gray on the other side here. You just gotta kind of bounce back and forth between the colors until it looks right as you're mixing. More warm color for this fence. And back to cool for this paved area. And all of these colors are bleeding together and flowing into each other. That's what the first wash is all about. Letting everything flow and bleed. Kind of mix itself on the paper. And believe it or not, first wash is already done. So I need to let this dry quite a bit for the next step. I need to be able to really control the paint, and in order for that to happen, I need the paper to be dry. So I need to let this sit for quite a while, and then I'll be back and we'll continue with the second wash. Okay, I've let my paper dry enough, so we're going to start the second wash. So I'm going to start in this area over here with these trees, and I've already mixed up some colors on my palette for this area. There's some darker greens, there's some more yellow greens, There's also some grays over here for the mountain in the background and for the shadow side of this bank. So I'm just going to drop in this tree. Now remember, everything in the middle value shape is going to connect. My goal is to find little areas to connect the shape. You'll see what I mean in a second here. A little area where that green gets more yellow. Just to add some interest. And there's a little highlight running along the top of this bank, almost all the way down. And I need to paint around that carefully. It's a nice little effect. And I really want to maintain that looseness that I achieved in the value study in the actual painting. I want things to be loose and expressive and free. Leaving some gaps in the body of the tree and the canopy. There's also a highlight on this power pole here that I really want to preserve if I can, so I'm just going to paint around the edge of that. And these greens will become bluer as they recede into the distance. So for this utility pole, we'll just mix up some of that gray. We'll just drop that in and try to keep the brush as straight as I can. It's okay if it wobbles a little bit. Doesn't have to be perfectly straight. This isn't a painting about utility poles. It just happened to be a cool feature. And I'll just drop in that reflection too, since, well, here, we'll do something. So, this will go right into the shadow side of this bank, preserving that highlight there on the top. You can paint the shadow side of this pole here. Some palm trees in the distance, kind of like that. Just drop those in real quick. Another iconic feature of the Phoenix skyline, palm trees everywhere. Remember to preserve the highlight on the top of that bank. That just creates a little bit of separation from the bank and the trees. And see how that green is getting more blue as it recedes into the distance. I can probably darken up these areas of the water too. Right here. Gives the water a really interesting texture. So I'm using my value study as a roadmap and kind of reminding myself where things need to be dark, where they need to be light. So like right here, I really like how you can see that highlight of this power pole reflecting in the water. I actually painted that in the value study, and I might have forgotten to do that if I hadn't looked at the value study and seen, oh yeah, there's that highlight in the water. Just indicating some ripples at the edge of this dark patch of water. Just with a few horizontal strokes. My goal is always to get the idea across in as few brush strokes as possible. It just makes things so clean and effortless looking, and it makes things look really... It makes your painting look confident. It makes you look like a confident artist if you paint with as few brush strokes as you can manage. So like, that was just one brush stroke, one motion, and that's it. Then I leave it if I can. So right here, just one brush stroke and it's done. Avoid the temptation to go back and mess with things. Sometimes you have to, but it's good to learn how to get things right on the first try. That's something I'm still learning. Definitely not perfect at it. But it helps portray a confident painting. Just dropping in the rest of these poles. Don't have to be perfect. Some of them I'm not even finishing the line, I'm letting the line break up a little bit. It just helps add to the looseness of it. Well, there's a few shadows on this mountain back here that I'm going to drop in. Right there. Pretty simplified version of the actual picture. Again, just simple, confident, get the idea across in as little brushstrokes as possible. Let the viewer's imagination fill in the gaps and the rest of the details. You don't want to copy the reference photo exactly as it is, because it will come across in your painting. It will just look like you're copying a photo instead of creating an original piece. And I'm probably going to have to do a glaze over this mountain, just a very light glaze. Once things are more dry, I want this mountain to be a little more warm than it is. And that's very easy to do. This is a very iconic mountain here in Phoenix, Escoda Peak. You can see it from most places in the valley. It's kind of in a central location, and if you stand on top of this peak, you can see the entire city. You got a 360 view. There's a few places where you can do that, actually. It's a really good city for hiking, unless it's, 120 degrees outside, then it's not so great. But right now, it's completely perfect. All right, now we're going to connect this area of these distant trees into these trees, which are more in the foreground. We're going to lighten that green up again. We're going to brighten it up with that more yellow mixture that I already had on the palette. Make it even brighter than that, actually. And that will really help create a sharp contrast between this this close-up tree and these farther away trees. Always looking for areas of contrast, not just in light and dark, but in warm and cool colors, in hard and soft edges. There's all kinds of different ways to create contrast. And that's what makes for a striking and interesting scene, is having those areas of contrast. Like right there is a good example. Super dark bank next to that really bright water. I've got a darker tree back here. I'm guessing it's probably a eucalyptus based on the color of the leaves, more of a blue-green. And then again, having that really dark tree here is going to push these mountains farther back. We're just creating illusions of 3D worlds on two-dimensional paper, and these are all tricks. They're just tricks. They're tricking the viewer's eye into thinking that they're seeing a three-dimensional scene on a flat piece of paper. Painting around that edge of the trunk on that Palo Verde tree, if I can. A really interesting little highlight there. Again, that contrast, that would be contrast between light and dark. And then there's those distant trees again back here. So we'll go back to that gray mixture that we used for this. I almost want my paintings to look like a sketch. I really, really love the look of like line and wash sketches, which is actually what I first learned to do, and I'm probably gonna do a series on that at some point, just like watercolor sketching. It's just so fun and satisfying and easy. There's no pressure, and that's what I'm trying to replicate in these bigger paintings, is the same feeling of a fun, quick, loose sketch. And ironically, if you want to paint loose, you really need to be very intentional with where you're putting your brush, which means you have to slow down. So to paint loose, you got to paint more slow. Just counterintuitive. There's just stuff happening. There's a little building right here that I'm not really worried about portraying it exactly right. Again, just sketchy looking. I don't want my paintings to be tight and rigid and perfectly straight lines and all that. When I first started, that's kind of how it was. But I've gotten better at loosening up over time. And the value study is something that really helps loosen up my paintings, because I've already painted the scene once, and so I'm free to just let my hand do what it knows how to do. Oh yeah, there's that bush right there. Let's drop that in, I guess. This gravel is going to need some texture, and then also there's this path right here that I need to darken up, because that's included in the middle value shape. That's way too dark, okay. That's way too dark. Something like that, probably. Let me know in the comments if you want to see more videos of me actually doing the value study rather than just talking about it after the fact. I wonder if you would find it helpful to watch me do the value study in real time, so you can see the thought process behind how I'm grouping values together and the kinds of decisions I'm making. And you see right there how I connected this path right into these trees. Just finding connections in this big shape. And as I'm dropping my brush along the paper, I'm kind of following the perspective lines. And you'll be able to actually unconsciously detect that in the paint. It just helps with the flow of the scene. Alright, now it's basically everything for the middle value shape. And you'll also notice how I kind of lightened up the mixture as things receded into the distance. I used less pigment and more water, which makes it more washed out. Another thing that just helps push things back into the distance. We got these wires on these poles, which I'm probably going to draw in pencil. They're just a little bit too thin for me to try to do in paint. I don't have a thin enough brush to do that. But what I'm going to do is add some texture to this gravel. Just here and there. That is too dark, so I can just take the same brush, just cleaned it off, got rid of that excess water so it's just damp, and I can just kind of scrub. I just want a little bit of subtle texture in this gravel patch. Again, following the perspective lines as I'm drawing the brush along the paper. So there's some dry brush marks happening. Dry brush is where you just drag the brush along the paper and the paint kind of skips over the texture of the paper. It's also why I paint on a paper that has a little bit of texture to it. This is Arch's cold press. And it naturally has a little tiny bit of texture to it, which helps with things like that. All right. So I think it's time to add our darks. We're getting pretty close to wrapping this painting up. I love a good, simple but satisfying piece. I don't want to sit here for hours and hours slaving away over one painting. I just want to be done, do it, be done, move on. So we're going to darken up this tree. I'm leaving a few areas of the lighter green just to give it some volume. I'll add some branches in here, why not? Since this tree is closer up, I can add a little more detail to it. Paint around this lighter tree. And this is all things I've determined already in my value study. So there's no guesswork. I don't even have to really think about what I'm doing. I'm just copying the value study. Quite literally just copying it. Darken up this area of water here. Bottom of the bank is darker. There's like a line of dark running along the bottom. That'll help separate it from the water itself. Let's see, where else did I have darks? Right here in some of these bushes or trees or whatever these are. Just indicating some of the shape. The paint is still a tiny bit damp, which is perfect. It's the perfect amount of dampness. It's not completely dry. It's just damp enough for the paint to flow a little bit. And as things recede, I will darken things less and less. Just a few patches here and there until it's gone. And it all just blends together. Because that high contrast really makes things pop out and makes things appear closer to you. So you don't want to spend all that time dropping in super dark things in the background. It will just look weird. It won't quite look like it's far away, if you know what I mean. Oh, where else? Oh, there's some darks in this tree right here. Help separate that from the background a little more. I'll leave that as it is. Same with this tree. I'm just using this random green, blue, gray color on the palette. This bush, it's got a little shadow too. I'll darken up some of the poles on this fence. Just a few of them in the foreground. And in fact, I think it's time to bust out our liner brush for these small details. Yep, that'll do it. And I think I want to splatter some paint in this gravel here. Just a little bit. Just give it some texture. That is such a good way to get a gravelly, rocky, sandy texture. So I'm holding my brush parallel to the paper, and I'm holding it pretty close to the paper to get those little small splatter marks. You want the paint to be fairly dry if you want these little tiny splatter marks. If you want bigger splatter marks, you should have more water on the brush. The more water on the brush, the bigger the droplets will be. So that's just something to keep in mind. And you can also change the angle of the brush if you want to get like a line moving that way. And I'm holding it really close to the paper so that it doesn't splatter and get everywhere. Yeah, ask me how I found that out. Trial and error, and more error than success. And I realize I still need to darken up some of this water, like right here. You don't think of water as having texture, but it really has. It's mostly just texture when you're painting water. And when you're painting these textures along the surface of the water, it helps to keep your lines flat and parallel and straight, because the surface of water is flat. It's perfectly flat. Unless it's a waterfall, obviously. Yeah, I really like that tiny little highlight right there. I think that's such a cool detail, and it really just adds to the realism of this piece. I'm trying to find the balance between loose and sketchy and then realistic. It's a fine line to walk. So these pylons, we can just drop those in. I really like painting power poles. They're really satisfying for whatever reason. So, where's my pencil? Drawing the power lines themselves. So I'm kind of doing a little dip in between each of the pylons. Doesn't have to be perfect. Yeah, we even ended up scratching out some power lines in front of these trees with the lead. That's cool. Wasn't planning on that happening. Happy accidents. I gotta love it. Yeah, we're gonna be wrapping up this painting here in just a few minutes. We're almost done. So, I do think the mountains in the background need to be a little darker. I've kind of been going back and forth in my mind as to if I want to darken it or not throughout this painting, but I think I've decided it needs just a little light glaze of burnt umber. It needs to just be warmed up a little bit. Because right now it kind of just looks like there's shadows floating in the air, because the mountain is kind of the same color as the sky. So I can fix that very easily by just glazing over this. And you want to do this after the paint is completely dry, or as dry as it can be, because if not, it'll get muddy and you'll end up picking up the paint of these shadows. Yeah, don't be afraid to glaze over areas if you feel like it needs it. I've saved countless paintings by doing this. It's great to get it right the first time around, but in reality, that's really, really hard to do. Especially in watercolor, which can just be so unpredictable. It really does have a mind of its own. And you just have to kind of work with what it gives you sometimes. That's why it's so fun. You really just, every painting is an adventure. You never know what's gonna happen. That looks so much better. Maybe some birds in the sky, and then I think we're good. Just a few here and there. Some are closer, some are farther away. They're kind of at different angles. I'm just literally doing like V shapes and splotches. As long as a few of them actually look like birds, it doesn't really matter what the rest of them look like. Well, I think we're going to call that a finished painting. I really hope you enjoyed this one. I hope you learned something, and I hope to see you on the next one.